Okay, welcome back from lunch. My name is Gabriel Bernadette Shapiro. I'll be emceeing this session. Find your seats, there's plenty of seats. Oh, there's more people coming in. Yeah, come on in, find a place to sit down. Tell all your friends. Our next talk is from my friend and colleague, Jim. And it's on hacktivism in war, clarifying discussion. So yeah, let's give Jim a warm welcome to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'm Jim. I've been with SentinelLABS for around 6 years or so. Before that, I've got a long history of malware research and threat intelligence and collection and all that fun stuff, kind of going back to McAfee in the mid to late 90s, so been around a long time. And that sort of is necessary to know because I come at the hacktivism ecosystem, not as a lover of political science or someone who's super enthusiastic about geopolitical tensions and all that fun stuff. I sort of came into this many moons ago by way of just tracing different tooling, different ransomware toolkits, et cetera, and seeing how they would kind of pop up into this ecosystem at weird times. And then that kind of led me to expanding my research into other areas of, quote, hacktivism. What is or isn't hacktivism? Is there still actual hacktivism? And all that fun stuff. If all of you should by now be loyal listeners to the Three Buddy Problem. If you're not, I highly recommend it. But if you've been listening to that lately, you've heard a lot of stuff in regards to hacktivism lately, especially in the context of some of the recent escalations wars. So Israel, Iran, Israel, Gaza, Ukraine, Russia, et cetera. There's been a lot of interesting cyber activity going on around these escalations and wars, and some of it is, quote, hacktivism, and some of it is actual hacktivism. And so we're going to clarify these terms and kind of split up who are some of these actors, and how can we better understand how some of this stuff is categorized. And again, I tell you about kind of my coming into this from a tooling perspective because it makes sense with regards to how I sort of tier these things out. So that's a quick introduction to what we're going to talk about. And I'm also going to kind of take a page from Jags a little bit and say that as I was socializing this talk with a few people leading up to this, it kind of evolved a little bit. And so I'm going to be maybe a little rambly, maybe a little general, but hopefully I'll still be able to clarify things, and I might jump around a bit, but just bear with me. So we're going to talk about what I call the tiers of hacktivism. We're going to talk about those at the top tier, which would be our like state-backed or proxy operation type stuff, APTs, if you like. Why would they do this? Why is it advantageous for state-level threat actors to utilize these personas or utilize these sort of puppet identities to carry out these actions? Give some examples, and then if we still have time, we'll talk about other tiers that are lower, like the actual old school, what constitutes hacktivism nowadays, and why that's still interesting. So we'll start with the tiers of hacktivism. So first and foremost, not all hacktivism is proxy operations, but that is most of what we hear about kind of in the news and in the media. So that stuff is up at the top, like your state front end, APT-ish proxy level operation. But if we start down at the bottom, that's where we have kind of what we see every day. The commodity hacktivism groups, channels, platforms, identities, et cetera. If you just open up Telegram and know where to look, or certain Twitter feeds, this is what you're going to see. It's a lot of posturing and a lot of noise. Almost all noise is what we see in this kind of tier of what I call craptivism. It's basically just a lot of political rhetoric, a lot of posturing, a lot of pointless alliances that don't really go anywhere, and a lot of messaging, but no real actual verifiable attacks that are novel or interesting or above and beyond, just kind of what we would consider commodity stuff in the research world. Now, this kind of bleeds up into what I call nuisance and borderline, where we have some of these same noisy groups, and you still have a similar noise level in this tier, but these are the guys that are starting to venture into sort of, bespoke-ish tooling and maybe a little bit more effective attacks. Maybe they're a little bit more adept at pulling off real DDoS attacks. But another thing that we see a lot in this area is folks foraying into ransomware, not only just to ransom or encrypt machines, but as a means to just carry out their, further their messaging, right? So it doesn't matter if the machine's encrypted. What they really are doing is just using the tools to replace the wallpaper or, and show the message that they're trying to amplify. So that's kind of this nuisance borderline tier. And then that bleeds up into what I call independent and capable, and then into the top tier. So independent and capable would be really, really, really effective, really, really, really capable groups and actors, but they're not proxy operations, right? So you could make an argument that folks like Belarusian cyber partisans might fit in here. You could make an argument that folks like Adon Sudan might fit in here. So there's a few other examples that we'll talk about, but this is right where we get up to the top, and then we start talking about some of the more recent interesting clusters. So at the top where we have APT and state front stuff, that's where we start talking about what we call Meteor Express, which is kind of the cluster that includes things like Predatory Sparrow, Indra, and all the other sort of identities that come with that. But then also, there's analogs to that in other countries, other locations, right? So there's Russian equivalents, Ukraine equivalents, et cetera. So if you spend any time looking at hacktivism, you'll see a lot of these familiar logos and faces. But again, I'm just talking about general noisy stuff, and a lot of these things, again, it's very high noise, low signal, just lots of rhetoric, but compared to the other tiers, you're seeing way less actual verifiable attacks and interesting stuff going on. So this is when we're talking about things like Tunisian Massacre Cyberforce, Uranon, Z Black Hats, some of the super old anonymous stuff from years ago. Just a lot of talk and phrasing, but not a whole lot of actual action. Now, as we sort of bleed up, like we said, nuisance, borderline, this is where we start to see some of the folks that sort of venture into other interesting and sometimes bespoke tooling. So, one of the more recent guys on this slide specifically would be the 313 team. And if you spend any time playing with ransomware, you've heard of BQT lock, same group, same guys. So again, we're starting to see more capability and more interesting activity. CyberVolk would be here as well as the rest of the Holy League. But again, it's not quite the level as some of the other guys. So when we start talking about the higher tiers, that's when we start talking about more interesting and sort of niche stuff. But again, we see a lot of good examples of what you could argue is independent hacktivism. And I know if you saw Amitai's presentation earlier, he kind of went into detail on some of the BCP, on one of the BCP operations, and kind of gave his take and his vibe on these guys. But there's others that sort of fit into this tier as well, right? But BCP is probably one of the most well-known, very active, especially lately, with regards to the Russian air carrier, the Aeroflot attack, where they grounded, I think it was like 40-some-odd% of the planes and all that fun stuff. So still very active and very effective and able to carry out real attacks that affect change and bring about some disruption and chaos, if you will. But other guys fit on here too. You could also throw in like Guacamaya, Adon Sudan, SiegeSec to some degree. Like again, the marker that I put on these is tooling and whether or not they sort of break out of this ecosystem as well. So in some ways, SiegeSec has been kind of a silly thing to follow over the years. But in other ways, these are the same guys that came out of like secret forums, black forums, and that whole world. And again, this is also a group that has ventured into legit ransomware operations with regards to things like GhostLocker RAS and Stormus RAS and the various other faces of that same ransomware, so like Dragon Team RAS, et cetera. So these guys have, you'll see these guys active in ecosystems outside of hacktivism, just purely based on semi-successful RAS operations. And again, another good example, Adon Sudan. I always like to talk about them because they kind of stand out in this. Because again, capability-wise, this is a very interesting group to look at. If when they first emerged, again, they would blend in with the noise and just general kind of rhetoric that you see on the lower tiers. However, this is also a group that was behind the Godzilla botnet. And they were pretty well to do financially. They had a lot of resources. And when they would carry out their DDoS attacks, specifically like the ones around October 7th, they weren't using like traditional botnets full of infected machines, right? These guys were like actually paying for good high bandwidth infrastructure to carry out those attacks, which sets them apart widely from those lower tiers that don't have those resources and don't have those capabilities. Additionally, like they even went further than that, right? So like around that time when Israel was cutting off IP traffic from non-Israel IPs, they simply just bought infrastructure within the country and carried out their attacks from there ongoing. So again, more capability, more interesting capability, and more action than you see. again, you could argue folks like potentially whomever leaked the Great Firewall stuff on Inlace Hacktivist, that might be something that fits into this category as well. Some of that remains to be seen. There's still some stuff emerging around that. And by the way, if anyone's interested in that leak, hit me up. I might be able to help you out. But so that's another thing that might fit in here. And other weird things, right? So like no bulge. That was a very strange situation, but if you look at how it was originally positioned and how that actor originally presented themselves, it was in the vein of a furry hacktivist that was just going to bat for artists in fairness and AI. And in their way of doing that was by attacking corporations that embrace AI or have been kind of under fire for maybe not being fair to actual artists and overusing AI, all that stuff. So this guy was poisoning extensions for AI-based games, huge hack and leak operations against some big media companies, and again, the ransomware angle, they were actually using Lockbit 3.0 to build their own version of ransomware, which they called no bulge lock. Excuse me. So again, capable, interesting, new, somewhat novel attacks, but they actually have an effect as opposed to the lower tier guys. Which brings us to the top, the front, the operations that we, if we go down the narrative that these are state-sponsored operations, then we can kind of talk about these guys. In that vein, these are front operations, covers, proxy operations, if you will, for state groups. And what's interesting about this is these groups the personas, I should say, can come and go, right? But the clusters that we sort of track behind them tend to stay around, and you can sort of trace them over time. But that's the key, which I'll continue to harp on, is the only real way to understand any of these groups is to trace them over a long period of time. Just kind of trying to get your vibe on them from one attack or one small time frame or one set of selectors or indicators, usually not enough to fully get the breadth of what's going on behind the scenes with these groups. But again, we have some famous examples here. We've got the Meteor Express guys, as well as some Iran stuff, Handala, Cyber Avengers. No Name, which not too long ago came out that was definitely tied to Russian government, but also some oldies here, like from DPRK. They've embraced this technique a couple times as well. So we see that in the form of stuff like Who Is Team with Dark Soul. I think Guardians of Peace and New Romantic Cyber Army were also other identities that they associated. So again, puppet personas, but that they're using these to actually carry out actual real serious attacks, right? So. Often these attacks have physical consequences, and often they are timed with other things that are happening in the physical world. So we'll see, a cyber operation often coupled with something going on in the physical world on the ground, operation-wise. But to continue picking on the same cluster because they're so widely in the news, these Meteor Express guys have definitely been kind of pushing the boundaries and pushing this sort of, if we call it a trend, pushing it forward. Even recently, they're still leaking stuff on Iranian officials and IRGC officials. Just even a few days before this conference started, there was a leak via Twitter from one of the personas with data. So this stuff is ongoing. And there's, every prominent sort of country nowadays that we talk about that is involved in escalations in war will have kind of an analog, right? So there's plenty of examples of these from the Russian side, even from the Chinese side. But the issue here, or the meat here, why these tiers matter and why we want to understand how each one of these kind of differentiate and also ultimately why they do this, is to fully understand and navigate through the noise and to be able to kind of cut through and differentiate what these different groups are, right? We know that the higher tiers are embracing these personas to mimic the lower tiers and blend in with the sort of general patriotic rhetoric and noise of the whole thing. It adds a little bit of fog to the whole operation. It adds some layers of plausible deniability if this can be just kind of pushed off or blamed on some rogue hacktivist actor, et cetera. It's not us. It's not the government. There's some ways of obfuscating source there that is advantageous to these actors. Additionally, you end up with kind of a bidirectional feedback thing because these lower tiers, the noisy guys, are often punching up and trying to imitate the higher tiers. And often that means they're imitating fake hacktivism, and that also makes this more chaotic and difficult to track sometimes. But the biggest thing why understanding these tiers and the different actors is the higher you go, the more time it usually takes to fully understand what they're doing and what their vibe is. Again, you can't get a full understanding of some of the personas that Sandworm has put out there over the last 10 some odd years, or some of the personas, again, that the Israeli guys have put out for the last several years, unless you track that stuff and understand it over time. Because again, the cluster behind these personas will reuse them often, burn them often, and those can all change. And the humans involved in running these personas can change, but the messaging will often stay very static static over time. So to that point, setting the top guys apart. I see I'm running out of time. So messaging persists for years and remains constant, as I was just saying. Again, these guys will persist across platforms and humans. So if Telegram's not working out, they'll move to Signal. If Signal's not working out, they'll move everything to something more private. They have ways of moving around, but at the same time, if you are in those communities or in those ecosystems, you'll constantly see the same messaging persist over time. And again, for the top tiers, that's not generally what you see with some of these smaller groups. They tend to fracture and be a little more dynamic with regards to how consistent the message is over time. These guys are also very much willing to forego financial gain for the cause, right? So, there's the famous quote with regards to the, I think it was the Novitex attacks, but basically, burning 90 some odd million dollars with your morning coffee. That's not something that the lower tiers of hacktivists would normally do. These guys they'll just toss money into vanity wallets with no interest in actually recouping or getting that money back. So they're foregoing money for the cause, again, continually over time. That's a consistent trait with these guys. Another thing that sets them apart a great deal is their ability to pre-position. Some of these attacks, again, picking on Meteor Express and the Predatory Sparrow guys, these things, in the bank attacks, for example, these things take time. There are steps involved. There's a lot of pre-positioning involved. Again, that takes a certain level of skill and capability that you don't see lower on. And again, pre-warnings, right? So we see situations where some of these groups will actually warn citizens of upcoming operations or upcoming attacks, which I'll show an example of soon. But again, just to keep repeating myself, you don't see that at the lower tiers. And again, with these guys, also messaging is key. We see what they want us to see, and despite the sort of the way that they want to build the personas out, all the communications are generally very measured, very careful, and very deliberate. At times written by professional writers or translators, just to make sure that all the messaging is correct and all the signaling is correct. Because one other thing that you start to develop over time when you're looking at these groups is you start to get a sense for writing styles and how they convey certain ideas. And there's a lot of signaling involved in these messages and in this style. There's often signaling to their homeland, certain signaling to the opposition, but also signaling to defense and researchers. It's not a coincidence that I keep picking on the same groups, but it's easy. It's not a coincidence that like Predatory Sparrow might tweet out a link to a POC for some new CVE. They're doing that for a reason. They want to get certain people's eyes on certain stuff at a certain time. So again, consistency of stated cause over time as well. Another thing that sets them apart is targeting choice and location and omissions of targets. And all the targeting is always going to be very, very, very strategic. So again, lower tiers, we're talking about a lot of noise, but even when we get into capability, we're talking just about general defacements, haphazard DDoS attacks, and the like. Whereas these higher tiers, when they're carrying out their extremely well-done operations, as we've seen, they're going after power, they're going after money, they're going after fuel, they're going after utilities, all the things that human beings and citizens need to enjoy the comforts of life. The core things that they expect their government or their regime to protect them, to protect for them, are the things that are being targeted by these groups. In the effort to build frustration and erode confidence in that regime or in that government, and erode and make the citizens kind of rise up against. And again, we see that with things like taking over television signals, taking over streams, and influencing the citizens to go out and riot or do things against the government, which ends up propelling the cause of these actors. So again, I talked about pre-warning, which is a big differentiator with these guys. We have here an example of a predatory sparrow warning. This comes via our friend Hamid. But translated, this is them warning folks of, saying you need to go fuel up because potentially there could be an issue. But basically, this is a warning that they sent out. You don't see this with the lower tiers. Again, just to make it that dead simple, you're not going to see this kind of sophisticated warning go out to a very large group of people when this thing to warn of pending attacks. So if you need to really take another way of sort of digesting these groups and understanding, we do have another method. We released a blog in 2023 on state-sponsored HALOs, state-sponsored hack and leak operations, in which we spell out a nice way to differentiate these things. I call it the JAGS method. It's easy to remember, PCSR, CCSTC, kind of rolls off the tongue. But again, let's look at the pedigree of these guys, how the continuity, where do they get the materials and how? How are they coordinating the releases? Who's benefiting? What are the effects, targeting, et cetera? Now, pedigree is probably the biggie here that gets a little foggy because originally when this blog was written, it was referring to groups like Indra, Predatory Sparrow, which have since reemerged, but also things like the DPRK guys, which again, by pedigree, meaning these guys come out of nowhere, there's no previous history, there's no online presence, and then they disappear immediately after the attack. So these are all good ways that you can judge some of these groups or personas as they emerge, which will help you kind of tierify these things for yourself. So why do this? Why would these clusters or government state actors want to do this and utilize these personas? Main thing, control narrative. Have say and control over how events play out. Make the opposition look smaller, erode confidence in the target regime, and make the citizens require some sort of change by attacking the very core things that are required for basic human comfort. Attacking basic human needs. Again, like I said, fuel, money, shelter, utilities. That kind of stuff is what will make people freak out and go crazy if they don't have access to them. And that's the kind of stuff that these guys are going to go after. Again, signaling. So signaling, what kind of signals are in the messages and how tailored or careful are they as opposed to some of these smaller, more noisy actors, right? So again, I talked about signaling in the homeland, signaling to the opposition, and signaling to researchers and defense. I would recommend paying big, if you follow this kind of stuff, pay a lot of attention to these signals because there's a lot more signaling to researchers and defense than necessarily meets the eye. And then sowing chaos and disruption. Like I said, sway the sentiment, mobilize the citizens, and get them to uprise against the target regime, if you will. So running low on time, but I do want to wrap up or kind of fly through it. So to wrap things up, and again, hopefully this kind of, again, I'm going kind of general, but the overall goal of these top tier actors, that are separated from the lower tier of craptivism is these guys want to shape narrative, mobilize, disrupt change, and they can do it and they are capable of doing it and they have, years of proven capability of doing so. The success of these groups is often measured in media uptake and virality. In other words, the whole point is to control and amplify the message, get the narrative out there, and get people to react. And so getting the news coverage or getting a lot of online chatter going about their operations and just getting their name out there is always of benefit to them. And to that point, overcoverage may end up being an issue, right? We already know that there's issues with Iranian actors and Chinese actors and most wanted posters and kind of glorifying them. We sort of see that, starting with some of these other smaller groups. So there may be some balance to reach there. The lower tiers do still deserve some love, and they are still interesting. There's stuff that goes on there, and again, that's kind of what originally drew me to this ecosystem. But there's a lot of interesting, like what I call a malware. There's a malware recycling center, as I phrase it, that happens in these tiers where really old, crappy malware that we're all tired of seeing lives on forever in these little hacktivist groups. So we still see like new groups pop up, but then they'll release like a version of ransomware that is just the SLAM ransomware builder or something based on chaos or really old arcane stuff. We still see Dark Comet and NJRAT and things like that in these communities. And they're distributed and shared as if it's like a hot new thing. So that's something to think about. And interesting from a tracking of threats perspective and tracking the life cycle of certain weird tools. So on top of that, always be skeptical and thorough with regards to digesting and interpreting claims from these personas or really just any quote-unquote hacktivist persona. You can't just take one post or one attack or one claim at face value. There's usually a lot more context that has to come in into the picture. In saying that, and also to wrap up, like most impactful hacktivism that we're hearing about today in the news, most of these big attacks that are attributed to, quote, hacktivist groups is faketivism. It is these state-sponsored groups, these proxies, as opposed to the lower tiers. So, either the definition of hacktivism is changing or we're getting it wrong, but most of what is being attributed to hacktivism lately is actually not hacktivism, it's actually this proxy stuff. But there is still actual hacktivism, which is important. And the other side of that is none of this is going away or decreasing or getting smaller, right? So, one thing I thought of doing, I could show you guys like, I could quantify some of this stuff and I could show you like graphs, but it's the same message either way. The bars are going to go up, the numbers are going to increase, there's going to be more. So the end message there is this stuff isn't going away, it's increasing. It's actually getting more chaotic, more difficult to track and understand over time. And so we need to be really, really careful when these things pop up that we fully understand what they are and who we're attributing these attacks to. So with that, I'll wrap it up and thank you.
All right, we do have a few minutes for some questions for Jim, and I know this is a topic which many of you have studied personally. So yeah, let's see those hands.
Hey, I really appreciated the talk. Maybe this is too much of sort of a political science academic question, but what do you see the relationship with this with traditional terrorism like the 2000s, 2010? Do you think there's a substitution effect of a lot of move to the online hacktivist world to gain more attention as these groups are, decapitated, or is this in addition to?
I think if I had to make a quick answer to that, I would say in addition to, right? So I think both still, yeah, if that makes sense.
Sorry, I thought you the mic part somewhere.
Or just yell.
He's like, no, not Thomas, not Thomas. A fantastic talk. I really loved it. Maybe in a similar vein, could we probe the bracket around what is hacktivism for a second? So, for example, how about doppelganger? Could you possibly include a contractor that it does kind of hack?
Yeah, so that's another thing I didn't touch on, right? So I think things are going to get also, again, more cloudy and more confusing when we start talking about contractors and PSOAs, which I didn't bring up in this presentation for a reason. But if we take the thought journey for a moment and pretend that something, so there already is some interesting stuff going on with regards to PSOAs and contractors also utilizing personas to a certain level, right? I think it may, in theory, get more interesting if we pretend that we go down the route of like things like hackback and letters of marque becoming more of a reality and all that stuff. I think we might see more infiltration of personas that are related to those contractors and those groups come out of that scenario, should that occur. Having said that, we are seeing some evidence of PSOAs and private militias, et cetera, also utilizing these methods, but also just on their own being active in a hacktivist-y kind of way. So, and I guess to step back a little bit, when I say pure old school hacktivism, I mean, there's absolutely zero connection to the state, and it's just all about ideology and methodology, and also even further back, like my background to hacktivism starts with like Max Headroom in Ashtar Galactica. And so when I think hacktivism, I'm thinking like that kind of hacktivism. Translate that to cyber, but then you add the state-sponsored component, and it gets really weird. But to your point, there's some infiltration of that, and I think it could, in theory, get more cloudy and chaotic with those actors coming in more, if that happens.
Okay, let's give Jim a big round of applause and move on to our next speaker.